Hello and welcome again to another broadcast of a summary of what we looked at in church this morning in Ballymagurney. And last week, for those of you who watched our broadcast, watched our video, you'll know that we started a study on the life of Joesph, and we looked at different lessons from his background. Well, this afternoon we want to just think about Joesph as a faithful teenager, as we find him here in Genesis chapter 37 and verses 1 through 4. Well-known account of how Joseph's father gives to him the coat of many colours. And we'll just read verses 2, 3 and 4 of Genesis 37 together. Verse 2, these are the generations of Jacob. Joesph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah, with the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joesph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joesph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colours. His brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren. They hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. Joesph, a faithful teenager. That's what we want to look at together this afternoon, as we find Joesph here in his home as the youngest of his brothers. Someone has said in a quote that God will not lead you where God's grace cannot keep you, or something to that effect. And I think that's very, very appropriate when we think of this juncture in the life of Joesph. Last week we saw that his family was a real mixed bag, a real difficult family that anybody would have been raised in, let alone this young man Joesph. We thought of how his family was blighted by the fact that his father had more than one wives and had all of these different children to all of these different wives. And we saw last week how his family life was a real mess. And we also saw how it would have been very, very difficult for Joesph to have been raised in such an atmosphere, because Jacob, his father, favoured and loved Rachel, Joseph's mother, and he then would have loved Joesph more than the rest of his brothers, because he was the son of Rachel, his beloved wife. And yet God, in his providence, has led Joesph to be born and raised in such a family. And so here we see in Genesis chapter 37 that in spite of this impure family, and in spite of the fact that Joesph had a very, very difficult upbringing indeed, God's grace still kept him. He was still, as we're going to see today, he was still a faithful teenager. In spite of all of the challenges that he faced, and in spite of, yes, even losing his mother, and in spite of the hostility that he would have faced in this family, and the fact that his brothers hated him, and we see that in verse 4, that very, very openly his brothers hated him and couldn't even speak peaceably unto him, that they didn't have a kind thing to say to Joesph. And yet for all of it, God's grace had led Joesph into this family, to be born and raised in the midst of this family, and God's grace kept Joesph as a faithful teenager in this family. Child of God, never forget that wherever you are, whether it's family circumstances, whether it's a place of study, a place of employment, whatever you're going through in life, God hasn't led you to somewhere where his grace cannot keep you. And the New Testament especially is full of references to the fact that God keeps us from falling. Think of that wonderful thought there at the end of the book of Jude. Now unto him who is able to keep us from falling. In 1 Peter chapter 1, we read that we are kept by the power of God through faith unto salvation. Kept. Unto him who is able to keep us from falling. Christ keeps us from falling. And that's certainly the case here with Joesph. God, he saved this young man at a young age, and he kept him faithful and true to himself. And I would say that it's good to remember that wherever you are, God is able to keep you and make you faithful to him. And this is what we find here in Genesis 37. In this study, where we think of just the first four verses of Genesis 37, and we're going to see now how Joesph was a faithful teenager in light of these difficult circumstances that he was raised in. First thing I think we see here in Genesis chapter 37, we think about Joesph being a faithful teenager, is the charge that this teenager followed. The charge this teenager followed. In verse 2, we read that he was feeding the flock with his brethren, and then he later on in verse 2, he brought the evil report back to his father. He was feeding the flock with his brethren. Now, that seems a very, very elementary detail. Basically, it simply means that Joesph was looking after sheep. And you think, well, what's the big deal with this? Well, as we have seen already, Joesph came from a very, very large family indeed. In actual fact, he was the 11th son. There was a younger son after Joesph, then Benjamin as well, and there were sisters as well. So, very large family indeed. And essentially, what happened in this family was, and in Bible times in general, was that the more complex duties they were given to the older brothers, in terms of running the home, keeping the family ticking over and so on, they were given to the older brothers, and the younger that you got, the less complex the duty that was given to you. And so that's why Joesph, it simply reads here that he was keeping the flock with his brethren, or looking after the flock with his brethren. It was obviously his job to look after the sheep. Now there's another example of this. You think of David. David had many brothers. It seems that David was the 8th down the line. He had 7 older brothers, and the first 3 of his brothers, they were sent out to war. But David, he looked after his father's sheep, his father Jesse, in the book of 1 Samuel. So there's similarities here between Joesph and David. David was looking after the sheep because it was the least complex task in the family. His other brothers would have had more responsibility. And yet the thing I want you to see here in Genesis 37 verse 2 is that Joesph was faithful in doing this. That's why we've called him a faithful teenager. It was a simple enough task for this young 17-year-old. And yet he did it. He did it with all his might. He did whatever his father asked him to do. He did it. And whenever an issue arose, obviously there was something that his brothers were doing that he didn't like, that he didn't find righteous, whatever it must have been, he then did the right thing, even though it was difficult, and he reported that to his father. So I want you to see at this point, we're going to look in the message in greater detail about this bringing of the evil report to his father, but the thing I want you to see at this point is that he did what he was asked to do, and whenever there was an issue that arose, he did the right thing. He did the right thing. And child of God, is a very, very simple lesson here, and yet it's something I feel that we have lost in general in the Christian church, and that's this, is that we are faithful in no matter how big or small the task is, we be faithful in doing that task. 1 Thessalonians tells us that it is required of stewards that a man be found faithful. Faithful. In other words, whatever you're asked to do, whether it's in work or in school or in the church even, you be faithful in doing that. And whenever something crops up, like Joesph, you do the right thing. That's how you display your righteousness. There's a term in theology which is called declarative justification or declarative righteousness. It's where you actually declare that you're saved by your righteous deeds or your righteous living. And Joesph here is actually displaying that. He's displaying the fact that he's a Christian because he does the right thing, even when it was difficult. Child of God, whenever something arises, do the right thing. Not the easy thing, but the right thing. Very often those two don't join. Very often to do the right thing means to do the hard thing. But nonetheless, God will always bless that person who does the right thing, who doesn't turn a blind eye to some misdemeanor, who doesn't make a mock at sin, but who does the right thing before God. We're not always going to get it right. But let's, like Paul, live our lives where our conscience is void of offence before God and then before men. We are to do the right thing. Scripture's full of this teaching. Isaiah 1 verse 17 simply tells us, learn to do well, learn to do good, learn to do right. James 4:17 tells us that him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it's sin. In other words, when the Lord speaks to you about something and you feel that it's the right thing and you don't do it, God says it's sin. Someone has said that integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Child of God, we need to always remember that God's always watching, but humanly speaking, there are times in your life when no one, humanly speaking, is watching, and yet we're to do the right thing anyway. So the charge that this teenager followed, Joesph shows he's a faithful teenager in that he is obedient to what he's asked to do, and he does the right thing when something crops up. The second thing I want you to see here is the clothing that this teenager wore. The clothing this teenager wore. In verse 3, we simply read of Jacob that he made him, that's Joesph, a coat of many colours. Now, teenagers especially that are listening to this broadcast, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say that there's one day in the school calendar that you love the most and you also hate the most, and that's non-uniform day. Because anybody who has teenagers or anybody who knows any teenager, they'll tell you that clothing for a teenager is of utmost importance. And this teenager, certainly, Joesph, he certainly wore important clothing, didn't he? Now, there's been much comment by way of commentary and much debate about this coat of many colours. This is probably the most famous coat that the world has ever seen or known. And there's something that we need to understand about this coat of many colours. It wasn't just this kind of novel, multicoloured, cool coat that Jacob gave to his youngest son because he was his blue-eyed boy. There's far more significance to it than that. The term coat of many colours in the Hebrew, it comes from two Hebrew words. The first word, it has the idea of a robe. A robe. Something that's long, maybe that would come to the wrists. So this is not a t-shirt we're thinking about here. This is something that comes to, something that's long, something that's dangly, something that comes to the wrist. But the second word in the Hebrew has the idea of something going down to the ankles. So we begin to see, don't we, that what this multicoloured robe must have been. I imagine, I could be wrong on this, but I imagine something in terms of the length of a dressing gown or something like that. You'll pardon the illusion, but that's how I imagine it. Something that comes right up to the ankles and something that goes right down to the wrist and then right down to the ankles. Something that's long. The point really here is this, is that you could not work in this. You imagine, men that are listening to this video, imagine trying to do a day's work in your dressing gown. You just wouldn't do it. Or something that resembled it, that's very long and very drippy. You'd be tripping on it, wouldn't you? It would be getting in your way of your day's work. That's very interesting because in Bible times, hired servants, labourers, they wore something that was short-sleeved. Something that maybe resembles a t-shirt. And you know what it's like today. You go out to do a day's work, what do? You either roll your sleeves up or you wear a t-shirt if it's a nice day. You don't want something to get in your way of doing that work, that job, that task, whatever it is. Bible times it was the same. There's nothing new under the sun. The hired servant, they had something that had short sleeves, as we would say today. So whenever Joesph was given this coat that went long down to the ankles and went to the wrists, Jacob, his father, was saying this, Joesph, you're above your brothers now. He was elevating him to a higher status, a higher rank than his brothers. And you think about this in Bible times, Luke 15, the prodigal son, he comes home and he says to his dad, Dad, I'll come home as one of your hired servants. What does his father do? He said, No. You're coming home as my son. And he told his servants, get the best robe and put it on him. That robe, the best robe. And it would have resembled something like Joseph's coat of many colours. The prodigal son's father was saying, look, you're not a hired servant, you're my son. You're my son. It was indicative of a higher rank or status than the hired servant. Joesph here was essentially being made the foreman of the family. Jacob was essentially saying, even though Joesph was the youngest son, he was saying to all of the older brothers, Joesph is the one in charge now. He was saying, look, when I pass away, Joseph's going to be the new head of the home. He's going to be the person who's running the family affairs, running the family farm. Joesph here was promoted in the reception of this coat of many colours. It's very interesting because this obviously irked his brothers, as we see. Verse 4, they couldn't even speak to him, couldn't speak peaceably to him at all. So I want you to see here that Joesph was faithful. He was a faithful teenager. He brought this evil report back to his father. And there's another detail in verse 3 that we're told. We're told that Jacob loved him because he was the son of his old age. Now, Jacob was 108 when he said this. 108, that's old. Was this just simply him looking again at Joesph, the fact that he was in his 90s and he was the son of his old age? No. The term in the Hebrew, it has the idea of a wise old son, or one born old. And the thought here is that Joesph had wisdom beyond his years. He was just 17, but he had tremendous wisdom and tremendous grace. So I want you again to see here that it's because of his godly character and his faithfulness and his wisdom, obviously, that he showed to his dad. That is why he is promoted and receives the coat of many colours. The lesson here is very simple, child of God. When you're faithful in little, God promotes you. God promotes you. This is what happened with Joesph. He was promoted in terms of his earthly rank and his earthly status. He was given more to do because God saw that he was wise. God saw that he feared him. Proverbs 9 verse 10 tells us that the fear of the Lord is what? The beginning of wisdom. Joesph was a young man who feared God, and God gave him tremendous wisdom. In actual fact, the rest of this chapter, you see him interpreting the dreams and so on. He had wisdom above his brothers. Joesph feared God, and God gave to him wisdom. Child of God, fear the Lord. Fear the Lord. And the Lord will impart to you spiritual wisdom. And when you walk with God day by day, and you show that you're faithful in little, and you do the right thing, God will promote you. Luke 16:10 tells us, he that is faithful in least is faithful in much. Think about the children, Daniel's three friends, Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah. They were described in Daniel 1 verse 4 as children or young people who were skillful in wisdom. And that's why Nebuchadnezzar promoted them to high ranks so early in their life. Why were they promoted? Because they feared God, and God gave to them wisdom. And yet, how often is it not the case that we, in seeking a promotion, whether it's in whatever, whether it's in church work, whether it's in normal labour or occupation, we just want it for selfish reasons, instead of just walking with God and leaving the results with him. Someone has said that the elevator to success is closed, and we must take the stairs one by one. I like the way that's put. Here's Joesph, and long before he is ever made Prime Minister of Egypt, he is climbing, as it were, the first step in the ladder to success before God. He is showing that he is faithful in little, and God, as it were, gives him a little step on the road. He is now climbing the first rung in the ladder, so to speak. He is showing that God can trust him with little, with a little responsibility. This was like a training ground long before he ever became Prime Minister of Egypt. The charge this teenager followed and the clothing this teenager wore. Lastly and quickly, the courage that this teenager displayed. Again, verse 2, we go back to this thought of him bringing this evil report of his brethren to his father. In chapter 49 of the book of Genesis, we read concerning Joesph that he was separate from his brethren. He was different from his brothers. And he was. Now, some have looked at this verse and they've said, well, Joesph was a bit of a telltale. And maybe the teenagers listening into this video, they would say, well, he's a goody two-shoes. He's a telltale. He the first sign of something wrong, he just went and he told and he touted. And that's why his dad gave him the coat and so on. But that's not the case. Think about the character of these brothers. We saw last week that 2 of his brothers were murderers already. We saw that his family was a real mess. It was one of bitterness, one of malice, one of deceit. Even in this chapter, and a few verses later, as we're going to see next week, his brothers all gang up on him and throw him into a pit. They want him dead. One of them even suggests, we should kill our brother. This shows you the character of these men, these brothers of Joesph. So it was very obvious, I feel anyway, that these men were not just doing something that maybe they shouldn't have been doing. They were committing gross sin. Whatever it was, we don't know. But Joesph, there's something that really irks Joesph about what they're doing. And it's not just him being pernickety. They're obviously doing something sinful, something probably immoral. This was an immoral bunch of men. And what does he do? He shows tremendous courage because he knows there's going to be consequences here. Joesph knows this. He's wise enough and privy enough. He was a prudent young man. He knows that there's going to be consequences, and yet he still does the right thing anyway. So he displays tremendous courage because he does the right thing and he knows there's going to be tremendous consequences here. And indeed there was. He was thrown into a pit. And I say this especially to the young. Joseph's a tremendous example to emulate. Because he's obviously very, very faithful. He's a young man who's walking with God. And he wants to be different from his brothers. And so he displays tremendous courage. Child of God, this is what the world is looking for. Different young men. Different young women. Young men and young women who will be like Joesph and be separate from the world. Be separate from their workmates. Be separate from their classmates. And stand up for what is good, what is righteous, what is proper, and what is right. As the hymn says, we are to trust in God and do the right. So Joesph here is painting you a picture of what a faithful teenager looks like. And I trust that God gives you the grace to not merely look at this portrait, but to seek to emulate by God's grace this portrait and be a faithful teenager, be a faithful young person, be a faithful older person before God. Joesph, a faithful teenager.